Got it. There you go. What else was I supposed to do? There it is. Okay. Looking at the book of Romans, we've been starting out in chapter 1 and 2. I'm going to take probably a chapter a week for a while. And what Paul is building is an argument for the gospel to the people in Rome and the surrounding areas, a combination to the Jews who are in Rome, but also to what they called the Gentiles, which is just the word the nations. And so it's the Jews and everybody else. And Paul is writing to them. He says in chapter 1, I'm eager to preach the good news in Rome because it's the power of God for salvation. And then he talks about how this good news is revealed to all mankind in the nature of the world, in creation itself. So those who choose not to believe in God are really without excuse because God has made it very evident to them. Chapter 2, he goes on to say that we really ought to be able to see around us the sinfulness of mankind, and that should give us a picture of God's goodness as by contrast. And he says anybody who chooses to judge another person is guilty of sin, just like the person that they're judging, because psychologists have actually said to us that there's a projection that happens, that in most cases if we see something in someone else that they're doing wrong, it's probably because we have it in ourselves, but we suppress that and say it's their fault, not our fault. And so we have this tendency to judge other people when we really ought not to be judging, because God doesn't judge except in His own appropriate way, and all of us are guilty of the same thing. Well, chapter 3 comes along and talks about the lack of advantage that anybody has, especially the Jewish people or the Hebrew people. For salvation doesn't come from the law. Salvation comes from God's grace, and not based on how we live out that law. So here's what, beginning with verse 1, as I'm unpacking, if you will, Romans chapter 3. Verse 1, so why do some think the Hebrew people have an advantage with God? Well, they have the covenant of circumcision, but really what is that? Well, actually it's a lot. God gave to them for the world the commandments to live by. Just because some of them choose not to follow God's words and believe in Him does not mean that God will not follow through on His side of the contract. He will never change. He is always true, always consistent, loving, and caring. Do not make the mistake of seeing God as a glorified human. We are the liars. God is right in all He speaks and just when He must judge. So Paul is trying to draw this distinction between man's nature, mankind's nature, and God's nature. And God's nature is one of service and love to us, not somebody who is legalistic or demanding that we follow certain rules and regulations. We see this clearly in the person of Jesus Christ, how He humbled Himself and became a man. Paul tells us in Philippians 2 how Jesus said that He didn't come to be served, but to serve. In the Gospel of John, He came to lay down His life for His friends, and in another place teach us how to love one another. Jesus came to teach us that doing good things helps us take hold of what really is life, is the way Paul described it. So it's in this love of God that we see the contrast between our sinfulness and his holiness. And God's plan was never to make us followers of the law, but to make us people who are aware of who he is as God. I remember in the prologue to the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus, it talks about how God said, because I've already been your God, and because I have brought you out of the land of Egypt, these are the ways I want you to live, which is a very interesting way of looking at it, as opposed to God saying, do this and you'll be my children and I'll be your God. It's, I've already done this for you. This is what I would like from you in return, as opposed to, you have to do this in order for me to still love you. This is the way I want you to live. It was a typical formula, if you will, in those days between the king, the suzerain, and the people, the vassal. It was called a suzerain vassal treaty. And a new king would come in, conquer a land, and would say, now that you are under my land and my control, these are the rules that we're going to live by. As opposed to saying, live by these rules and you can become a citizen. No, you are a citizen, now you have to live by these rules. Paul goes on in verse 5, and he carries on the argument. So in some way, our evil living teaches us about the goodness of God. It lets us know that God is always good, even when he determines there is a need to react in wrath. Now, these are my human thoughts, Paul says, okay? And so he throws that little caveat in there. God is never unjust or unrighteous, otherwise he would not be fit to judge the world, okay? You can't judge if you aren't separated and apart from the law and perfect. And we know that doesn't happen on a human level all the time, but God could not judge us for what we do or don't do if he were not unrighteous, if he were not righteous and just. Verse 7, if our sinfulness demonstrates the glory and truthfulness of God, then why would we still be held accountable for our sin? Paul says, because we are still sinners. We've done sinful things. But we should not think that we can continue in our sin just because our sin demonstrates the glory of God. That would make no sense at all, and the nations would have a right to condemn us on that fact alone. Again, God is not requiring, Paul says, that we live by the law in order to earn his love. The law teaches us about our proneness to turn away from God's goodness, to our selfish and our sinful ways. Verse 9, he picks up again and he says, the Hebrew people have no leg to stand on, thinking they are better than others. All people on earth are under the curse of sin. Even the writings of old say, and then Paul lists 6 different quotes out of the Psalms and Isaiah and Proverbs. He says, from God's perspective, all humans have sinned and committed unrighteousness. People do not understand the work of God or seek to know him better. Everyone has been drawn away by the lure of this world and live out their selfishness. None seek after what is good. That comes from the book of Psalms. He says in another passage from Psalms that people dig their own grave by the words they speak. He says in another psalm, their words are like the poison of snakes. And another one, he says they continually speak evil and bitter things to one another. And again, he says out of Proverbs and Isaiah, They do not mind killing and murder. They seem to leave misery and destruction behind them wherever they go. And then again from the Psalms, he says, and the idea of peace is just a dream they cannot attain. They continue to live without any fear or reverence of God. And so he draws this picture in his argument that the people are under the curse and do not have the hunger for God that God would like to have people come to him and have fellowship with him. And so we see in this, everybody has turned, everybody has sinned, everybody has decided that they are going to work without God. And I see that often in just the increasing numbers of statistics, if you will. If you go on the internet and you look up atheism, the statistics are this huge growing number of people and countries that are becoming more and more atheistic, where they're choosing to say there is no God. That's not just agnostic. I'm not sure. I haven't quite figured this out yet. It's I don't believe there's a God. And that is growing and growing. And so there's almost a sense in which Paul's argument in Romans is more apropos to today than it might have even been to them, where they had a huge number of people who were God-focused people, but not necessarily the God of the Hebrews. But they had lots of gods in their day. Now we've got this growing number of people throughout the world who are saying, no, there is no God at all. And Paul is saying, no, it's evident in the creation. It's evident in the fact that there is sinfulness and there's got to be goodness someplace. And we only have the law, he goes on to talk about the law, as something that gives us a knowledge of sin, helps us to understand that we would never be justified just by doing the law, because that doesn't work. Paul probably was the best example, if you will, at least from his own perspective, of being somebody who tried and tried and tried and tried to be the perfect Pharisee, to live by the law in complete detail. He called himself a Pharisee of Pharisees, that he pushed it to the limit. And he now realizes, and he's speaking from a point of realizing that it has nothing to do with how hard you work at doing the law. It has everything to do with what God has done for us in the grace and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's so many places especially in the Psalms, where it says no one is righteous, no one understands, no one seeks God, no one does good, and so forth and so on. And basically no one is without sin, whether it's the pagan or the Jew, the moralist, the Christian, the Gentile, the other nations. God is the only one who is trustworthy. Doing evil would never produce good in life. Jesus told those pictures all the time, stories of the good tree is going to produce good fruit. The evil tree, the bad tree is going to produce bad fruit. You can't get good fruit from a bad tree, and so on. Now back to verse 19, Paul carries on with this argument. Let's talk about the law for a minute. Those who live by the law will be judged by the law. And when we all stand before God in the end, no one will be speaking quite so boldly, for we will all be in awe of God, and anything he chooses to do will seem right and just to us. No one will be able to stand on their reputation before him, for those who think they obey the law will find out the law was there to help them learn how sinful they really are. Paul just sees the law as being something that teaches us this is sin, and if you're honest, there's no way to live up to it. And it was a little easier, if you will, when you saw just the Ten Commandments, and they said, "Thou shalt not murder." But when Jesus turned around and says, "Well, wait a minute, you've heard that said, but let me tell you something else." What that means is you shouldn't even say to somebody, "You fool," because you've committed murder in your heart as soon as you do that. And so it's a little easier for us to be strictly to the law and say, "No, I didn't kill anybody, but I've been mad at people. I've called people fools. I've decided that they're stupid and idiots and that kind of thing in the confines of my car, and I can do that." But in reality, that's just the same, Jesus says, of bringing upon them this thing called murder. So the law itself does not judge us, it just informs us. The law is not, if you will, an instrument of justification, only an indication, or if you will, an instrument of sin, helping us understand what that is. So what is the remedy according to Paul? He sees it as justification by faith. We've talked about a lot about that. Verse 21 picks up that theme again and says, "Something new has come to us from God. Along with the law, we have now seen the righteousness of God, which the law and prophets predicted, told us about." The righteousness of God came to us in the person of Jesus Christ, whom we believe to be God in human flesh. Through him we understand all people have sinned, and in that state cannot fully enjoy the glory of God unless they receive the gift of grace. We are redeemed by the work of Jesus the Messiah. God publicly demonstrated his grace through the death of his Son, Jesus, on the cross, his blood being the price that is paid for our sin. He demonstrated to us his righteousness in our lifetime, his justice, and his willingness to welcome anyone who believes Jesus is the presence of God on earth. So Paul is saying there was a time when it appeared that righteousness with God, or the ability to measure up to his glory, was based upon how well we abided by the law. But Paul says that was a wrong perception. He might even throw in there, "Even I thought that was true, but I don't believe it anymore." God has opened a door for us to come into his glory through faith. Faith in Jesus as the Son of God. Believing that he came from God, died to pay the price for my sin, rose to be with the Father, and is still alive today, interceding on my behalf. So Paul wraps up the argument then in chapter 3 with verse 27 and following. We desire our accomplishments and the good things we have done to have some weight with God. But God did not base his love for us on what we have done or how we have measured up to his law or even how we've measured up to our own law. All he asks of us is to believe that he is accepting us based on our faith in his Son Jesus. Let me say it one more time. Paul says in verse 28, God is making us whole and right, completely separate from how well we obey the law. Obeying the law is good for us, but it has nothing to do with God's opinion of us. And this gift is not just to the Hebrew people only, but also to all of the nations of the world. There's only one God. And he gives his grace to anyone who believes in his gift, whether they have been circumcised or not, whether they are Jew or not. Believing in this does not do away with the law, but it actually establishes the law. And we uphold the law because God uses the law to teach us about his ways. He says one could boast if salvation was based on works. But it's not. We could say, I've been good enough. I remember years ago there was a program of evangelism. Some of you might remember the little pamphlet called The Four Spiritual Laws. Well, James Kennedy in Coral Ridge, Florida, I think it was, in a Presbyterian church, went to work in that Presbyterian church, and after being there, I think it was about a year, had driven the congregation from 50 members down to 7 or 8 or some crazy thing like that. And he said, we got to do something about this. And so they had visitors coming all the time, and so they started going to the visitors' homes. And he created this program, wrote up this program called Evangelism Explosion. And the people would go and visit the visitors, and they would get to know them, talk about the things they had in common, and then they would ask a question. If you were to die tonight, and Peter would ask you, why should I let you in? What would you say? And he said the majority of people that they asked that question to in the course of that church, which grew to 3,500 people after they started this program, the majority of people answered that question by saying, I've been good enough. My good outweighs my bad. In other words, I'm depending on the law. I've been living as best I can by the law, whether they knew exactly what the law was or not. They've been applying all of their goodness to the hope that it would outweigh the bad in their life. And of course, Paul is saying right here in this passage, that didn't work. That's not what God's looking for. God's asking us to believe in Jesus. Boasting doesn't really work. The only boasting that we should be boasting about is what we know God to be doing in our lives. All that we have received from him. We're justified in the eyes of God because we love his Son. Nothing more. I think that's really, really important for us. And of course, it asks the question then, in my mind, summing up Romans 3, do we treat others based on how they live up to our standards or our perception of God's standards? Or do we love them unconditionally as God loves them? In my experience as a pastor and as a person, over the last 50 or 60 years, one of the biggest struggles that people deal with is the fact that they are living their life to please their parents, or started out that way. I want to make them proud. I want to make them happy. And that becomes more of a burden to people than it does a freeing event. And every time, at least in movies or in actual conversations, when you get to a point as an individual where you can say, wait a minute, I'm really trying to please you, Dad. Dad would turn around and say, well, you do. You already please me. I love you no matter what. But far too often, it's my perception of how he thinks that gets me into trouble. And what Paul is saying is that the same thing is true with God. If we believe that God is only going to love us if we are good little boys and girls, then we're going to find ourselves continually frustrated. God wants to set us free from that frustration. He wants to open us up. And he does that by giving us the gift of grace. Freely believe that Jesus is Lord. And God's love which is already poured out upon us just surrounds us at that particular point. So I just encourage you to think about how much God loves you, and at the same time think about how you pass that love on to others. Are you expecting them to live up to some standard, yours or his, or are you freely loving them with the love that he has freely poured out on you? There's a song, number